In the spring of 1922, on a small farm in the Bavarian countryside, 6 people were murdered with a mattock, one by one, in the dead hour after midnight. Their bodies were stacked in the barn under a layer of hay. And for at least 3 days before the killings, and at least 3 days after, somebody else was living in the house with them, eating their bread, feeding their cattle, sleeping in the attic above their beds. The killer was never caught. This is the story of Hinterkaifeck. 104 years later, it is still considered the most disturbing unsolved murder case in German history. And the reason is not the violence. The reason is the days before, and the days after. Let me show you why. The farm sat by itself, about an hour's walk from the village of Grubers in Upper Bavaria. It was not a name on a map. Hinterkaifeck is not a town. It is the name of a single farmstead, hidden behind a stand of trees, on a piece of land too small to attract attention and too remote to attract help. The family who lived there were named Gruber. Andreas Gruber was 63, a farmer, by every account that survives, an unpleasant man. Neighbors said he was suspicious, miserly, quick-tempered, and physically abusive to his wife and daughter. He was known to beat his servants. He was known to argue with neighbors over property lines. He had, years earlier, been convicted of incest with his own daughter, Viktoria, and had served a short prison sentence for it. When he came back to the farm, Viktoria stayed. Cäzilia Gruber was 72, Andreas's wife. She had spent her entire adult life on that farm. She rarely went into the village. Karl Gabriel was 35, the daughter, a widow. Her husband Karl had been killed in the First World War, although there were people in the village who privately questioned whether Karl Gabriel had actually died on the front, or whether he had simply walked away from the farm and arranged for someone to declare him dead. His body had never been recovered. His comrades' accounts of his death did not match up. Viktoria had 2 children of her own. Cäzilia, 7 years old, named after her grandmother, and Joseph, 2 years old. Joseph had been born in 1920, after Karl Gabriel was already officially dead for several years. The village knew exactly who the father was, so did Viktoria, so did Andreas. Nobody talked about it openly. That was the household on the morning of March 31st, 1922. 5 Grubers, behind a curtain of trees, on a farm where nobody visited and nobody was welcome. And then there was the 6th. Maria Baumgartner was 44. A new maid. Andreas Gruber had hired her through a relative to replace the previous maid who had quit 6 months earlier. The previous maid had quit because, in her words, the farm was haunted. She said she heard footsteps in the attic at night. She heard somebody walking around in rooms that were empty. She told the priest. She told her family. They told her she was being foolish. Eventually, she left anyway. Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck on the afternoon of March 31st, 1922. She had never been to the farm before. She unpacked her small trunk in the maid's room. She met the family. She ate dinner with them. She went to bed. She was dead within 6 hours. But to understand what happened that night, you have to go back several days. Because Andreas Gruber, in the last week of his life, had been telling people in the village that he thought somebody was on his farm. 6 days before the murders, fresh snow had fallen across the region. Andreas walked his land the next morning, the way he always did. And in the snow, on the path from the forest to his own farmhouse, he found a single set of footprints. Boot prints, adult, leading out of the trees straight toward the house. They went up to the farm. They did not come back out. He searched the buildings. He searched the barn. He found nothing. No man, no broken lock, no sign of forced entry, but the footprints in the snow only went one way. Over the next several days, Andreas Gruber told at least 4 people about what he had seen. He told a neighbor. He told a coffee merchant who came by the farm. He told the village postman. He told a man from the next farm over. He said he was hearing footsteps in the attic at night. He said he had found a newspaper in the house that nobody in the family had bought. He said his keys had gone missing from where he hung them by the door and then reappeared in a different place days later. He told one of the neighbors he thought there was a stranger living in his house. The neighbors thought Andreas was paranoid. He had always been paranoid. He was famously paranoid. They listened, and they nodded, and they went home. The last person to see the family alive was the postman on the morning of March 31st. He delivered a newspaper and exchanged a few words with Andreas at the door. He noticed nothing unusual. The maid Maria Baumgartner arrived that same afternoon. The 7-year-old Cäzilia went to school that day. She was a quiet child, normally cheerful. The teacher would later say that on her last day in class, the girl seemed withdrawn and stayed alone in the corner of the schoolyard. That night, sometime after dark, the killer made his move. What happened next is reconstructed from the position of the bodies, the blood spatter, and the medical examiner's notes. There were no witnesses. The killer was already on the farm. He had probably been there for days, hiding in the attic, coming down at night to take food. He had eaten bread from the larder. He had used the family's stove. He had likely been the one feeding the cattle. The dog had not barked at him in a long time. Sometime in the late evening of March 31st, he waited for a moment when the family separated. The two adults, Andreas and Cäzilia the elder, went out to the barn. It is not clear why. One theory is that they heard a noise. Another is that the killer somehow lured them. He met them in the barns. He killed them with a mattock. A mattock is a heavy farm tool, something between a pickaxe and a hoe, with a wide blade on one side and a pointed blade on the other. It is the kind of tool every Bavarian farm had leaning against the wall. The killer used the wide side. The injuries to both Andreas and Cäzilia were to the head and face, delivered with enormous force, repeatedly, after they were already on the ground. Then he went for the 7-year-old. Little Cäzilia, the granddaughter, was probably called out next. The medical examiner found that she had not died immediately. After the blow to her head, she had lain on the floor of the barn for several hours, conscious, paralyzed, slowly bleeding to death. She had pulled out tufts of her own hair with her hands. She was found surrounded by them. The killer then went back to the house. Viktoria, the mother, was the next to die. She was found in the barn doorway, also killed with the mattock. The position of her body suggests she had come out to find her family. That left 2 people inside the farmhouse who had heard nothing, or who had heard something and were too afraid to investigate. The maid Maria Baumgartner in her room, and the 2-year-old Joseph in his crib in his mother's bedroom. The killer entered the house. He went to the maid's room first. Maria Baumgartner was killed in her bed, in her sleep, with a single blow. Then he walked to the bedroom where Joseph was sleeping. He killed the 2-year-old in his crib. 6 people, in less than an hour, in near total silence, with a tool the killer had taken from their own barn. And then he did not leave. This is the part of the case that has stayed in the German imagination for a century. He did not run, he did not flee into the trees, he did not even leave the farm at dawn. He stayed. For at least the next 3 days, and possibly 4, somebody continued to live at Hinterkaifeck. The cattle were fed. There was fresh hay in the stalls. The kitchen stove had been used. There were dirty dishes in the sink. A meal had been cooked and eaten in the farmhouse, on a date after the family was already dead. The bed in the attic, which the killer had apparently been using, was rumpled and warm. Smoke was seen rising from the farmhouse chimney for 3 more days. A neighbor saw it and assumed the Grubers were home. A traveling mechanic came by the farm on April 1st to fix a piece of machinery. He knocked. No one answered. He walked around the buildings. He thought he saw movement at a window. He left. The postman delivered mail on April 1st and April 2nd. The mail accumulated on a hook by the door. He noticed, but did not investigate. On April 4th, 4 days after the murders, neighbors finally became alarmed. Little Cäzilia had missed 3 days of school. Viktoria had missed church. Nobody had seen any of the family in the village. 2 neighbors and a coffee merchant decided to go out to the farm together. They arrived in the late morning. The house was quiet. They called out. No one answered. They walked to the barn. They opened the barn door and they found the 4 bodies stacked in the hay. The 2 grandparents, the daughter, and the 7-year-old. The killer had arranged them. He had not dumped them. He had laid them out, side by side, and covered them with hay and an old door. The men ran to the house. Inside, in her bed, they found the maid. In the crib, they found the toddler. The crib was still warm. When the police searched the farm, they found that the killer had not taken anything of significant value. There was money in a drawer. There was jewelry on a shelf. Nothing had been stolen. This was not a robbery. Whoever did this had not come for money. He had come for the family. The investigation that followed was, by modern standards, a disaster. Over 100 people were brought to the farm to look at the bodies. The crime scene was contaminated within hours. The bodies were autopsied in a tool shed on the farm itself, then beheaded. The heads were sent to a clairvoyant in Munich who claimed she could read the last images from a dead person's eyes. The skulls were eventually lost during the Second World War. They have never been recovered. The Bavarian police interviewed hundreds of suspects over the following decades. Some were drifters. Some were estranged relatives. Some were old enemies of Andreas Gruber, of which there were many. The case was officially reopened in 1986 and again in 2007 when forensic science students at the police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck were asked to take a fresh look at the surviving evidence. They named a single most likely suspect. The police have refused, to this day, to publicly say who it was. They said only that the person was dead and that naming him would cause unnecessary harm to his still living descendants. So the case remains officially open, and the theories remain. The first theory is that the killer was Karl Gabriel, the husband who had supposedly died in the war, the body that was never recovered. The man whose comrades' stories did not match. The theory goes that Karl had walked away from his marriage, learned years later that his wife had a child by her own father, and returned in a rage. The footprints in the snow, the keys, the strange newspaper, were all him preparing. The killings were revenge. The second theory is that the killer was a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor. He had been romantically involved with Viktoria. He had been named as the legal father of Joseph, the 2-year-old. He stood to gain or lose depending on the will. He was one of the men who found the bodies, and witnesses noted that he moved through the crime scene with strange familiarity. He knew which rooms to enter. He picked up the body of the 2-year-old, his alleged son, and held it without any visible emotion. 2 neighbors said he knew where things were in the house that he should not have known. He died in 1941, never charged. The third theory is that it was a drifter. Bavaria after the First World War was full of them. Demobilized soldiers, broken men, walking the countryside. One of them, the theory goes, found Hinterkaifeck, found a way into the attic, and lived there for weeks before he was discovered. When Andreas began to suspect, the drifter struck first. The fourth theory is the one that the 2007 students settled on. They will not name him, but what they will say is that the killer was someone who knew the family well, knew the layout of the farm, knew the routines, knew which door creaked, knew where the mattock was kept. The killings were not random. They were not opportunistic. They were the end of a long, private grievance. And here is the part that haunts Germany. Whoever it was, he had been living in that attic for at least a week. He had walked above the family at night while they slept. He had listened to them argue. He had listened to the 7-year-old say her prayers. He had heard the 2-year-old cry. He had watched the new maid arrive and unpack her trunk, knowing she would not live until morning. He had decided when to start. And after he finished, he stayed. He slept in the same house as the bodies. He ate at the same table. He fed the same cattle for 3 more days. Then he simply walked out of the trees and disappeared back into the country he had come from. So here is the question. A man can kill 6 people in an hour with a tool he found in their barn. That is rare, but it is not impossible. What is impossible to imagine is the patience. The week of waiting, the footsteps in the attic, the newspaper that nobody bought, the days afterward in a farmhouse full of corpses, sitting at the family table, feeding the family dog. Was Hinterkaifeck a crime of passion, executed by a man who lost control and then could not bring himself to leave? Or was it something colder, the slow finish of a long plan carried out by somebody who wanted the family to know, in the last seconds, that he had been there all along? 104 years later, the German police know the answer. They have a name, they will not say it. You decide what to do with that.